How does that start?
The book of Daniel.
That's an extra one we had last week. You can find lesson 3, page 1 on the back side.
What does question 9 say?
The book of Daniel.
Book of Daniel.
Oh.
Yeah.
2, 3, 4, 8, 11. Got it, thank you. Sorry for the delay.
But I think it's fitting to begin. Lord God, we thank you for the blessing of government, even perfect as it is. Therefore, this week we thank you that another election has passed peacefully, and that we have some certainty that we will get what we can expect going forward. Be with all those who are elected and going to be installed in office. Be with all those who have lost their elections or are going to be leaving. Lead all of our leaders to govern with wisdom for the benefit of all people on earth, especially for the good of the country. We ask all of these things. So let's open up to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel gives an excellent example of how God's people act when their government oppresses them or forces them to act against their conscience. In each story, tell what the faithful did not do and what they did. So I think all three of these are going to be mostly familiar to us. So, Gene and Norm, why? Thank you. I'll talk about Daniel 1. Gene and Norm, why don't you read Daniel 3 to yourselves? And then Rich and Linda and Joel, why don't you read Daniel 6? So, what were they asked to do, and how did they respond? Turn on my mic.
You said 6.
Yes. All right. I think we've had time. I apologize to people who are watching the Bible study for my playing with the cameras and probably making you seasick. So Daniel 1. Kate, do you want to summarize or do you want me to do it?
Nebuchadnezzar looks for the wisest and the best looking young men from the captured Israel and has them put into pair. Daniel says, I can't eat the special food and wine the king is giving us. Let me just eat vegetables and water. And he tells the person in charge of him that he can give him a set amount of time, and he can compare me to the other young men. If I look worse, then I guess I have to eat the special food provided to me. If we look the same, if we're doing just the same, and we can continue to eat the vegetables and drink water. They get to the end of the time, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego look better than all the rest of the men. They're also smarter and wiser. And so they are then the king's special advisors.
So what were they afraid to do? Or what didn't they want to do? What had they been ordered to do?
They were ordered to eat the special food and drink the special wine.
Why do you think they didn't want to?
I would guess that it's like possible that it was food that was sacrificed.
Okay.
Or it was just excessive.
I think it's also possible it was just not kosher.
It was pork.
That they could not guarantee that it had not been contaminated in some way with unclean things. And so their response was, as respectfully as they could, simply to say, why don't you just, we'll receive less. They didn't ask for special accommodation. They actually asked for less accommodation so that they could still do the work that they had been asked to do and still be able to keep themselves pure. Daniel 3. What's the event of Daniel 3? We just heard it last week in church.
Right. King Nebuchadnezzar had a gold statue and had all the people raise attention and started to bow down and worship it.
Okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
And to go keep anything. I refuse to do it. Send them in furnace.
Hmm?
7 times more. People that threw the furnace died from the heat. That I think it's close enough to all men being witnessed. But there were 4 from the furnace, not 3. So if they walk out, they walked out. They have no effect of the fire whatsoever. The king realized that their God had protected them. So because anybody else wanted to keep their God would become the people. So that's
Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar builds the statue, and he wants all the people to bow down when the music plays. Just to probe that a little bit, why do you think he would do something so foolish?
Egomaniac.
Okay, we could assume there's evidence for that he's just a maniac. But let's assume there's some logic to what he's doing.
Testing his people is evil.
Okay, there's a test to see what can I order people to do. I'll admit that's taking his words and actions in the worst possible way. But it is something that totalitarian dictators do. They order their people to do things just to train them to take orders. And the more pointless the order is, the more sometimes they get angry if it's not followed. But I think Katie said it. There's also, if you have a kingdom that's made up of people from all these different tribes, all these different nations, so the Babylonian Empire stretches from parts of Iran, not very far into Iran, because that's where the Medes and Persians are from, but all the way up through Mesopotamia, through Lebanon, and all the way down into Egypt. So from like the mountains in Turkey all the way down to Egypt and all the way to the borders of Iran. That's a lot of people, a lot of nations. And at a time where there's no TV, radio, all of these nations have their own gods and their own villages, their own traditions. How do you get them all to see themselves as one people and as your people? Get them to worship the God you tell them to. And you don't forbid them, in this case, from worshiping other gods. But we're all going to worship this God. And so you can be a Packer fan, a Raiders fan, a San Francisco fan, a Vikings fan, but we're all going to cheer for the Beavers. So you can have your own separate things, but we're all going to unite around this. And so there's some wisdom in that. I think when we read the New Testament and when we read about early church history, that's worth remembering too. That the Romans were trying to have a united empire. And so while they would allow you to worship any gods you wanted to, there were times that they said, you all need to worship this God, because that's how we stay together. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, we're not going to bow down to this golden statue. And I'm going to read it word for word, because I love the way they put it. Since our God, whom we serve, does exist, he is able to save us from the blazing fiery furnace. So he may save us from your hand, your majesty. But if he does not, you should know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Do Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego assume God will save them? No. They say, he is able to save us, but he hasn't promised us that. But no matter what, we are not going to bow down to the statue. And then God does save them. Nebuchadnezzar learns the lesson, but not well, as we'll see in a couple chapters. But that's also what polytheism does. Nebuchadnezzar can confess again and again that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the God of Daniel, is powerful and is able to do things. But it never seems to stop him from also trying to worship all the other gods, or even proclaiming himself to be a god. Because if you believe in multiple gods, the Lord can be God, but so can all these others. Daniel 6. What's the event? Yeah, that's the king of the Persians. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the order is, all your prayers need to be directed to the king and not to any other god. And Daniel has his daily routine that every day he would go and he would pray to the true God. And he faced Jerusalem. Why would he face Jerusalem? Okay, the temple's destroyed. I think it's a physical expression of his expectation that God will keep his promise. So, I'm in exile, but my home is where God promises he will be with us. And so he continues to do this. He's caught, he's thrown to the lions. The angel shuts the lions' mouths. Darius has the other officials thrown in. So it may be worth noting, so it's a regime change, right? Darius probably has his own yes men to go along with him, but he gets to Babylon, and there's Daniel there, Daniel's probably in his 60s, 70s. He's an old man, maybe even in his 80s by now. But he's just so capable. And he's just so trustworthy. After all, he's not a Babylonian. He's old, so he's not going to be like organizing a coup or anything like that. He had nothing to do with the Medes and Persians taking over the place. He just serves faithfully, and sometimes you just want things run well. And so Darius says, I need this guy in my new administration. But you can imagine if you've been serving the Medes and the Persians your whole life, trying to work your way into power, how it would feel to have this old Jew in here, and you want to get rid of him, and you can't find any reason to say that he's doing anything wrong. His decisions are always the right decisions. So you come up with this plan to stoke the king's pride a little bit, because the king wanted to see himself as divine. So all people should direct their prayers of their heart to you. Why do you think Daniel didn't just pray in his head? You ever wondered that?
Because he had to have the window open.
Why? Okay. Okay. So my translation says maliciously accused. I'd have to look it up, but with ill intent. So this is a separate little thing, but for the 8th commandment, you shall not bear false testimony against your neighbor. Luther, when you read, especially in the large catechism, is less concerned about how, he's saying that you shouldn't lie, but that you uphold your neighbor's reputation. In fact, a little bit of it is mind your own business. So not to be seeking to hurt your neighbor through either the courts or through reputation in the community. You uphold your neighbor's name. So he's more concerned about how you build up your neighbor's reputation than he is concerned about, well, just don't lie. So the word in the Hebrew has that to paint things in the worst possible way. So they accuse Daniel of being disloyal, which would be the lie. He's not being disloyal to the king by praying. But you're right, he did actually pray. I wonder also if Daniel went up to his room and opened the window to pray, because he probably lived in a segment of the city where a lot of his own countrymen lived. And Daniel is an important, revered man among his people. And they need to see that he is not going to obey this command. There also might be a little bit of, this is not a command that the king gets to give me, and so I'm going to demonstrate that reality. That dead or alive, this is not a place where the government gets to command. They don't get to direct my prayers. Period. Full stop. And they need to know it. There is a time and a place for that. So what do you notice about all three of these now? Huh? Did they ever disrespect the governing authorities? Right? Now, maybe you would say, well, Daniel, by blatantly praying, disrespected, but not really. He's still, as he addresses the king, he's as respectful as possible. And the king seems to realize immediately what had happened, and he's not angry with Daniel. But yeah. Right? And now, how we read things changes, so I suppose if the three men in the fiery furnace, if you wanted to add some sneering to the "Your Majesty," but I don't get that impression. We're not going to do that. Order away. I'm not going to do that. Period. Full stop. We will not serve your God. But they're not disrespectful. They draw their line and they stick to it. But they, A, don't expect the government to conform to their will. B, they're willing to accept the consequences for their actions. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't say you have no right to throw us into the fiery furnace. As I said in the first chapter, they don't demand that the king provide kosher food for them, or that he go buy from the Jewish quarter of Babylon. And Daniel doesn't say to the king, "How dare you throw me to the lions? You know this is wrong. You can't possibly do this." He knows the consequences, and he accepts the consequences of his choice. And then finally, they trust in God. I'm going to ask a question that we don't really know the answer to, but I think it's worth asking anyways. I swear. Why do you... They don't have a promise that God's going to preserve them. Why do you think in this case God chose to do these miracles? So I'll go through a little Bible history to put some context to that question. There are times in the Old Testament where God does miracles. So Abraham, Jacob. But then you have 400 years till you get to Moses. Joshua. Then you have 300 years till you get to David. And then you have then you have Elijah and Elisha. That's like 150 years after Solomon. Then you have another 200 years till you get to Daniel. And then you have 500 years till you get to the New Testament. And the rest of that time, you don't get the impression that miracles were happening all the time. There were prophets. You don't get the impression that there are miracles happening all over the place. So why at those places and at those times did God perform miracles? Strengthen their faith. You can see it. Teach them to love and trust in God. I think also these are all kind of hinge points in the history of God's people and in salvation history. And so to teach God's people, but also to preserve God's people. If those who stood up for God and the Jewish faith in Babylon were destroyed, what do you think that would have done to the regular people? Well, sometimes, to see the people who can give the most testimony, see them trust in God and God come through, that affects the people. So I think it's just worth noting, like, these are special, extraordinary times. And God can choose to act, and He acts in wisdom. And we don't always know what that plan is, but we can see it at work here. And we can trust that God will work for the good of His church on earth in every place. So while we don't expect miracles, we do expect God's hand at work. What are your other thoughts on Daniel and the other exiles living in Babylon? Question 10. Is the United States a Christian nation? Okay. Maybe I'll ask it a different way. So I didn't write the Bible study, so I don't, even with my notes, I can't necessarily, I can't read the writer's mind. But I'll ask it a different way. Are we closer to the Israelites living in Babylon or the Israelites living under King David or King Hezekiah? Okay.
We are not as oppressed
Okay.
as the Jews that live in Babylon. Nor are we living in the
Okay.
We have much more freedom to live there. But it is what it is, and it's what it is. They erected statues.
So, by the way that the answer in my study guide is written, I'm guessing the writer is getting at he has heard people say this is a Christian nation, or you'll hear it's established on Christian principles or the Judeo-Christian morality, or however you want to put that. And he points out that most of our founding fathers Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, were not Christians, they were deists, meaning they believed in one creator, but he just kind of wound the clock and then the clock just goes. And so it's all up to us. It's kind of God's hands off. They have a hands off God. I wonder if framing things that way ties our hands in a way that's unnecessary. I would maybe say that America is a nation that's founded on natural law. And that natural law, although corrupt and incomplete, and we struggle to always see it, natural law does line up with what the Bible has to teach us. When we teach, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. These are things that we by nature know, or that we can see are for the good of all people. And people generally can say, yes, that's good. And so as we act in our culture, although we recognize that we're not a Christian nation, we are a nation that has upheld natural law, and I think we're better when we continue to strive that way. There's a deep divide in our political discourse today. We are subjected to false information, exaggerations, and angry rhetoric. Think that's going to stop now? Election's over? No? What will guide a Christian's actions and speech in regard to political discourse? Okay? Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. How do we as Christians handle the reverend in our society today? Okay? Is that what the Bible says to do? No. Well, we'll get there. I have 5 minutes, so I think I can get there. So hold on to that thought. What are your other comments? Okay. Okay.
Sometimes the answer is yes, I can ignore this, and I don't have to respond.
What are your other thoughts? We could all use a little bit more grace in our interactions with each other. Gene mentioned it seems to be all or nothing. But I think that's also become true of not just, well, if I support this candidate, I have to support everything that means I support everything they think, say, or do, which, man, I don't know that I want that responsibility put on my shoulders in regard to any candidate unless I'm going to be made president, which I don't want that responsibility either. But, you know, we've made things that are complex black and white. That if you don't support this policy, or if you say that this thing is bad, that means that you agree with everything that this side says about that topic. And so what often ends up happening is you're both talking about two different things, and you don't actually talk. You don't actually talk at all. All you do is repeat slogans at each other. What is our goal as we talk to our neighbors? Sharing the gospel. What else? Our goal should be that we want the best for our neighbors and for our communities. And that means I can't be afraid to speak the truth and let the lie rule the day. And so that also means sometimes I may have to listen very carefully to what a person's actually saying. The Bible says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. Before I speak, I better know what I'm saying is true. And I should be as clear as possible in what I think and why I think. But ultimately, I think we have to recognize our vocations. So Joel, you said ignore it. When you're at work, is your vocation to get your employees, your fellow coworkers to agree with you politically? Am I called to convince the internet that my tax policy or my immigration policy is the right one? Sometimes remembering what my actual responsibilities are gets rid of a lot of this stuff. My neighbor says something about politics. It's not necessarily my vocation to go and tell them why they should support this or this policy or this action. And in all these things, to speak the truth in love. To remember my responsibilities and be committed to the truth. And if I don't know the truth, maybe I just need to keep my mouth shut. There's a lot of half-truths that get spoken. And there's a lot of jumping to conclusions happening. And if we assume the best of our neighbors, that goes a long way versus assuming the worst. We'll continue next time. I have a plan, hopefully either 1 or 2 lessons more in this. I do want to be done with this study by Advent, because I have a different plan.